Hi, year 12s. I'm back here with chapter 3, and this is all about Santos Sr., who is the father of current Santos Jr. This particular chapter is in a diary entry format, so we could clearly see that by the titles and most of the diary entries. I mean, there are so many time spans. The chapter spans almost for 2 years of the characters' lives, and definitely you can see that through the dates of the diary entries. And as I told you, we are all, most of the chapters are revolving around the death of Chapel and the grief that is associated with that. And even through Santos Senior, we are getting some ideas and backgrounds related or leading to those events. We are getting a background about the birth of Chapel through Santos Senior's diary entries. So different perspectives, we are getting different perspectives from through different voices, as I told you in the introduction part. When I told you the background, I told you Degoy is actually using multi-perspectivity or polyphony. Poly, as I told you, poly means many. Phonic voice, so many voices, we are hearing voices, many voices. So here we are uh, getting a summary of all that has happened through Santos Senior's diary entries. So let's start with 1796. My wife, God bless her soul. Let me just take the highlighting thing so that, yeah. My wife, God bless her soul, appeared in a dream and stated categorically that I had permission to marry another. There is no other, there is no woman who walks this earth noble enough to take her place, none. I am bored with ordering disgruntled slaves around. I am bored without my wife. My son is a treasure, but he is not enough. So obviously, we could see that he is bored without his wife. My wife, God bless her soul, appeared in a dream, he says. So he is actually bored after the death of his wife. There is a growing sense of loneliness, we could see that. And he talks about his son, who is actually a treasure. But he says that is just not enough for him to move on. And we know my son refers to Santos Jr. Jan 20, my son asked how his mother died, and is it time he knew. I told him her memory was too sacred to me to discuss her death. From his contorted face, he seemed more confused than anything. One day soon. So Santos Jr. always asks about his mother's death. How did his mother die? Feb 1, who cares about my loneliness these 5 years? Again, we are getting in the idea that he is having a sense of loneliness. And he says, no one is cared, no one is actually cared about my loneliness. Feb 9, Whitechapel made a fascinating knot with a leather, which when pulled untangled. He is by far the best worker, and he has the most agreeable manner. He knows what it is to lose a wife. So here we are getting a good idea about Whitechapel, the slave, and Santos Senior actually says that Whitechapel is really skilled at many things. He is by far the best worker, and he has the most agreeable manner. So everyone agrees to that he has got best behavior. He also know what it is to lose a wife, because Whitechapel has lost his first wife. Now, he gives us an indication about his wife's name. My wife's name was on my lips, Caroline, and I said so loudly, I woke myself. So, again, getting the idea of or the name of his wife, Caroline. Feb 23 argued with Mr. Chappell about the treatment of his slaves. So here we could see how they have got different opinions about slaves. He thinks I'm too severe with them. I would have kept my peace, but he had just told me that he did not want my boy running about his house because his daughter was being distracted. She is too, for God's sakes, they play together. Again, the authority and power of Mr. Whitechapel as a plantation owner. Mr. Whitechapel would like to treat the slaves in a better way, in a lenient way, and he accuses Santos Senior that he is actually he thinks I'm too severe with them. And again, Mr. Whitechapel also doesn't like his boy Miss Santos Jr. running around. He's just 2 years old because he doesn't want her daughter Lydia to be distracted. So keep that in mind again, that relationship between that master, and even though overseer is a white person, still that authority of Mr. Whitechapel is still there. 1st of March, my son asked if his mother was in heaven. So still Santos Jr. is wondering about all those things. March 8 is really important. Rations of slaves to be increased along with one extra break in the afternoon following an inspection by the master of Whitechapel plantation. So on March 8th, Mr. Whitechapel announced that the ration of slaves must be increased with an extra break in the afternoon. So again, that shows the leniency of Mr. Whitechapel, the way he treats the slaves in a better way. And he said they looked thin. So Mr. Whitechapel, the plantation owner, was of the view that the slaves looked thin. And here we are getting Santa Senior's view and I'll put that in a different color. What good? I'll put that in a different color maybe. What good is fat slave to anyone but himself? Mr. Whitechapel, you're wrong. Cattle need fattening, not slaves. And he clearly emphasizes his view that it is not the slaves who need fattening, but it is the cattle. So even treating the people, even slaves, as or even the cattle are getting better treatment compared to slaves. So you have to keep in mind his perspective or his point of view about Santa Senior's point of view about slaves is, what good is a fat slave to anyone but himself? And again, on 15th of March, Whitechapel asked if my son was going to do my line of work. I was adamant that he was not. I think my vehemence startled him. He took a step back and showed more white in his eyes than when he smiled. Should I explain my meaning? No, not a slave. However, amiable. Again, 25th of March, 2 of the elder women slaves have died from fever. I'm only the chief overseer here, but I think it is the overfeeding that did it. Again, look, again his ideas and perspectives about the slaves. He says that 2 older slaves have died from fever, and he is saying that it's because of, he thinks it's because of the overfeeding. They will have to be replaced at least with one new girl. Mr. Whitechapel is in complete agreement for once. Market day Tuesday. We'll choose a girl about 15. Again, choosing, look at the dehumanization, considering slaves as just commodity of buying and selling. Just treating them as commodity. Talking about buying and selling the slaves, which is actually a dehumanizing way. That's why they are saying market day next Tuesday. We'll choose a girl about 15. So that those lines actually highlight the extent to which slaves are considered as economic commodities capable of being sold and bought against their will instead of being respected as a dignified human being. So the attitude of Mr. Santos Sr. is clearly reflected through those lines. I was holding Caroline in my arms. There was nothing to distinguish waking from sleeping, nothing, not very important. Again, April 5, I think our new girl is really a woman. I mean, she must be at least 22. As young, look at the young age. They are brought as slaves. Granted, she works well, has adjusted well to her new home, and the others seem to like her. She is kind to my son. He likes her almost as much as Whitechapel does. So Whitechapel does like, he likes her almost. He likes her almost as Whitechapel does. So that's also really important. She's kind to my son. Again, on April 12th, I told my son, again, that's a bit of racism there. I told my son that we are different from slaves and human standing before God. Look at his views again, inhuman views of slaves. I told my son that we are different from slaves in intelligence and human standing before God. He asked why Whitechapel could do a knot that I couldn't do. That question is really important. At least we are getting a clear idea that Santos Jr., the son, is capable of questioning all the arbitrary social divisions. So that's why he is asking that question. He asked why Whitechapel could do. So that indicates that Whitechapel is actually skilled, and even Santos Jr. is the child, the boy is actually trying to recognize that. So through Santos Jr.'s voice, De Gore is trying to actually question the arbitrary social divisions. And his first joke, not a bad one. I said doing things like that was not a proper measure of intelligence. Now, what did Santa Senior, the dad, said? He said doing things like that is not actually a measure, or untying a knot is not actually a measure for intelligence. Then he asked why they were dark and we were bright. And look at the word, his word bright. So Santa Senior's failure to recognize his son's observation as a valid argument. He's failing to recognize that his son has got a valid argument. And that failure shows how his convictions about slaves' inferiority actually blinds him to any logic that demonstrates the contrary. So that actually shows that he is not ready to accept that valid argument posed by his son, young son. And next, April 19th, my old cook is still ill. The new girl who insists she is 15 who insists she is 15, so she says that she is 15, made a better meal than the old witch ever scrambled in port. Might try to trade in my old model. Again, look at the racism. Might tried to trade in my old model for this new one. Again, treating them or viewing them as commodities, changing them or trading them for the new model and old model. Look at the words used by derogatory terms used by Mr. Santos Sr. See what Mr. Whitechapel says. It would mean buying another girl for the fields. Good cooks are hard to come by. Must be careful not to overemphasize her abilities as cook. Otherwise, he will warn her up at his house. Now, May 2nd, not very important. May 9th. Am I wrong to look at a slave girl and feel like a man for the first time in 5 years? I must be desperate. I need a woman. So we could actually, it's a sign of his lust. And when the young, attractive, and competent slave actually reawakens his latent sexual urges, and he fantasies about having a sexual encounter with her. And May 26th, I told the girl she was to be my cook and care for my son. She seemed pleased. So Santos Jr. is actually talking to Cook and saying that I would like you to be my cook and care for my son. And she seemed pleased, as any slave would be, to leave the field. Why do you think she is happy? Because people working in the fields have got back-breaking work. Cook's relief at changing task actually reveals the harrowing conditions that the slaves actually endure in the field. They had to work hard, but at least in people who are working in home or houses is actually a bit lesser duties. They are doing a bit lesser duties, not hard, not a back-breaking kind of job. So that's the reason why she is a bit relieved. But definitely we know that she is under violent or she is under threat from Santos Jr. Whitechapel has struck up quite a friendship with my cook. Now here he is indicating that Whitechapel has struck up a quite good friendship with my cook. The old dog, 12 daughters to his name. Little wonder his poor wife died. Forgive me, Caroline, but it's true. The man should keep his breeches on. So again, Santos Jr. is not very happy about Whitechapel, the slave's friendship with his cook. July 6th, not very important. July 22nd, I had occasion to beat a slave for insolence. So here again, occasion, look at the use of that word occasion. I had occasion to beat a slave. So that shows that he is actually lucky. He's considering that as an occasion. He's lucky. He was lucky to beat a slave for insolence. Just my luck that Mr. Whitechapel saw me as I booted the scoundrel. And he says that Whitechapel saw me as I booted the scoundrel. Look at the brutality done by Santos Sr. He took me aside and ordered me to exercise restraint. He said I was never to use my feet or fist on a slave again, only the whip or stick. He will be rewarding them next. So again, we could see the lenient, at least a bit better Whitechapel. the plantation owner. He said, I was never to use my feet or fist on a slave again, only the whip or stick. So though they are not allowed to use their feet, they were allowed to use a whip or a stick again. Still, Mr. Whitechapel, the plantation owner, believes that slaves must be treated using whip or a stick. And then today is my son's birthday. He is 6. It's also the anniversary of Caroline's death. So from that point, we understand that he is actually, or the birthday and the death day of Caroline, as well as Santos Jr. is on the same day. That means maybe on the day of birth or after giving birth to Santos Jr., Caroline have died on the same day. Died on the same day. May God rest her soul. Grumpy all day, cook baked. And I want you to look at the capital letter used there. Until this moment, Cook was mentioned with a small c. You could see that here, small c. Cook's name actually highlights that Santos Senior only sees her as a person meant to receive or meant to exercise any kind of homely function, not as an individual. So the person who cooks is actually cook. So even that name highlights that. So here we can actually see the change of her name from a small letter C to a capital letter C, indicating that that became her name, that profession, her profession actually became her name. So cook baked. The house was perfumed with smell of baking all evening. Only Caroline baked like that. So that means he is really impressed with the young girl cook. And August 24, Whitechapel asked Mr. Whitechapel if he can marry Cook. So again, here Whitechapel, the slave, is Santos Jr. gave an indication before that Whitechapel has got a good relationship. Now Whitechapel has asked. It's a very straightforward relationship, and that's the reason why Whitechapel has asked the plantation owner if he can marry my cook. Damn it, now she'll be with child for him and nursing an infant, not half as useful to my household. So he is really angry and irritated about Whitechapel, and Santos Senior is also having a kind of jealousy or rivalry against Whitechapel the slave. August 30th, what does Whitechapel want with a wife? 12 daughters is enough for one man, several men. Use one of them for comfort. Look at his views again, using daughters for the comfort, not unheard of. Permission was granted by Mr. Whitechapel, and now he realized that permission was granted by Mr. Whitechapel. Their marriage ceremony is fixed for Sunday on the next convenient rest day, since there is much to do. Mr. Whitechapel will bless the marriage, a passage from Bible and a smile. So the permission has been granted for the marriage of Cook and Whitechapel the slave. And again, Santos Senior is really angry at that. September 9, Whitechapel taught my son how to jump into the air and click his heels. He was hopping between steps and doing the same thing with maddening regularity. So I forbade him to do in the house. Whitechapel, oh wise one, teach him how to stand still on one leg like a stick insect. So Whitechapel's love towards Santos Jr., treating him like his own son and teaching things. September 16th, must stop noticing Cook when she crosses a room. She must notice me noticing her, although I haven't noticed her, me noticing her. So again, that actually shows his lust. Caroline was in room, again flipping back the time. Always it's not in linear narration. September 23rd. And flipping back in time, Caroline was in a room with a crowd of women. I was the only man. I had my way with them all. Cook was among them. She was sweet as the rest of them. A good night. And 22nd of October, marriage postponed again. So the marriage between Whitechapel, until this time, I find another Cook marriage between Whitechapel the slave and Cook has been postponed, as Santos Senior said that he hasn't got a cook. So until he get a cook, the marriage has been postponed. Again, that highlights the rivalry between the two men, Santos Senior and Whitechapel the slave. When I told Whitechapel, his smile did not even cure. Noble. 26 October 12th. Not a good stock at the market. Women who lied about their ages to pass as girls. No girls passing as women. Mr. Whitechapel said something on the right back about the clamor of abolitionist. That word is really important. Abolitionist. Abolitionists reaching new heights. I said on the plantation of Mr. Whitechapel, it was a far off din on account of his contented slaves. He liked this a lot and laughed hard and long. It was funny, but not that funny. So that actually shows that beyond the microcosm of Mr. Whitechapel's plantation, or beyond Mr. Whitechapel's plantation, political activists are actually fighting against racism, and they are trying to put an end to slavery, or they're trying to abolish slavery. And that's why Mr. Whitechapel's mention about the abolitionists reaching new heights so indicates that around Whitechapel's plantation there are political activists who are actually fighting against racism, and who are trying to put an end to slavery. 19th of October, I invited Cook into my bedroom on a false pretext. Again, you could see his cunningness. I invited Cook to my bedroom on a false pretext that there were dishes in there to be removed. She rushed in and out before I could rise from the chair. She seemed to be smiling. So again, she escaped that time. Cook, we could see the crooked nature. We could see the crooked nature of Mr. Santos Senior. Very crooked and cunning. Crooked nature of Santos Senior. You can clearly identify there. Again, Mr. Santos Jr. is worried about his mother, asking how mother died. 10th of November, my son said he wanted to be an overseer when he grew up because Cook said uh, overseers were well rewarded and highly respected. I waited for him to settle in bed and summoned her before me. I reminded her about our talk concerning my son's queries. She was ready to answer. I slapped her. Look at the brutality committed against Lee. I slapped her. She sobbed like a child. I held her. Perhaps she is 15. I pushed her from me when I felt my loins swelling. Could not sleep again. The brutalities you could see there. 17th of November, not very important. 24th, Christmas Eve. Cook was around longer than usual. I could not concentrate on anything my eyes fell upon in the Virginian since I was listening to her about the house. After she put my boy to bed, I waited for her to pass my door, grabbed her arm, covered her mouth, and dragged her to my bed. Again, we could see the first, we could actually, through that narration, we could see the first rape. I told her if she made a noise, she would soon be dead. So again, the strict thing, the strictness and brutalities you could actually see there. I said she could have whatever. Look at the way I said she could have whatever she wanted from my wife's closet in return for her silence. But only one thing she asked. She asked to be allowed to marry Whitechapel right away, or she will tell both Master and Whitechapel, who would first kill me and then himself. So that first rape is happening there, and then Mr. Santos Senior asked her what does she want, or he said he could have anything from his wife's closet, but again she insists that she just wanted to marry Whitechapel the slave. And 25th of December, cookies at her quarters. Oh, what? 1st of Jan. Whitechapel married Cook today. So they got married. Whitechapel, the slave and the cook. A big affair for the slaves. He has more blood in Mr. Whitechapel's stock of slaves than there are slaves unrelated to each other. What if they turned against us all? 6th of Jan. Cook asked to be returned to the fields. I refused. So Cook is so tired of, or he's worried. She's actually worried about Mr. Santos Senior. So that's why she's asking to return to the fields. I refused. I asked her if she has told anyone. She said no, not even her husband. So constantly questioning her. I was relieved, but hid that as much as I could. I reminded her that my wife's closet was at her disposal. She said she would never step into a dead woman's shoe. So she was such a nice girl, and she said I would never step into a dead woman's shoes. Next, 9th of Jan, we could see the second rape. He is actually raping her cook again. I grabbed cooked and pulled her into my room. So second, she fought so much that both of our clothes were torn. She bit my hand. I resorted to choking her until she virtually went into a faint. So many brutalities. You could see the phrases there. And she cried. I promised her it would not happen again. So that is the second rape. Saying of second rape, second brutality. 10th of Jan, early morning, I was woken by Whitechapel, cook, and Mr. Whitechapel himself. So looks like she has said that to everyone. Early morning, I was woken by Whitechapel, cook, and Mr. Whitechapel himself. I knew their business. For a moment, I considered, denied everything my word against theirs. The word of a white man is worth that of how many slaves? But Mr. Whitechapel had that look I saw on his face when he came over to reprimand me for putting that lazy slave. So Mr. Whitechapel had that same reprimanding look. Not a look of inquiry, but of resolve. I thought better of lying. Mr. Whitechapel said he would fine me. So Mr. Whitechapel said that he would fine Santos Senior. He said a condition of my staying on this plantation would be that I apologize right away to the afflicted parties. So that was a condition put forward by the plantation owner. He said parties. The girl was one thing, but Whitechapel. So Mr. Sanders Senior couldn't even think about apologizing to Whitechapel, the slave. Mr. Whitechapel repeated his condition. I apologized to Whitechapel and Cook. So we could see Whitechapel, the plantation owner, Mr. Whitechapel, making Sanders Senior to apologize. At least, at this moment, Mr. Whitechapel is trying to defend his slaves against the overseer's violence. So it's actually a display of justice that appears to reinforce the vision of Mr. Whitechapel as a fair protector of his slave. Though most of the time he is just saying that he is a fair protector, he doesn't do that. But at this moment, he is actually displaying a sense of justice. And he is showing justice to the slaves, especially Cook and Whitechapel, the slave. Mr. Whitechapel summoned me to his house. Upon my arrival, I found Whitechapel, Cook, and Mr. Whitechapel together. Cook revealed to them that she and I were intimate once before the last time and that the incident robbed her of chastity. So here we are getting an indication that she is pregnant. Whitechapel claims he had not touched her before their marriage. Whitechapel was not smiling. So it's immediately after the marriage, and she is pregnant, and Whitechapel clearly know that. Or Whitechapel claims that the slave Whitechapel claims that he had not touched her before the marriage. Whitechapel was not smiling. So we are getting a clear indication that that child that Cook's child is actually Santos Senior's. 14th of Jan, not much. 10th, what should happen to a woman on a monthly basis and not happen to Cook? I hope. All right, so we are getting clear indication that she is pregnant there. Cook is pregnant. 17th of Feb, another meeting with Whitechapel, Cook, and Mr. Whitechapel. My fine has been doubled on account of Cook's pregnancy. So fine has been doubled on account of Cook's pregnancy. Whitechapel says Cook is his wife. Whatever the outcome, he loves her. Everyone has been sworn to secrecy by Mr. Whitechapel. So everyone has been sworn to secrecy by Mr. Whitechapel. And this is what this is what Mr. Whitechapel is pointing in his chapter, that no one was allowed to, in chapter 2, he says, no one was allowed to talk about that after that incident. No one was to raise the matter ever again. That is on page 34. No one was to raise the matter ever again. Now we are getting the clear indication. Now, why did he say that? It's because on that day, everyone has been sworn to secrecy by Mr. Whitechapel. What do I say to my son? Your mother died in unusual circumstances. God blessed her with faculties. March 10, when he's a grown man, I'll tell him what he needs to know. 17th of March, I imagine Cook looks big-bellied already. April 1st, Caroline has risen from the dead, so it's more like a dream. It's like a dream. 20th of April. Nothing much. 29th, my son recognizes some words on page. He will read soon if he mixes little with Mr. Whitechapel's daughter, who is proper little Mrs. So Whitechapel's daughter is actually Lydia. They play together at front of the house before dusk. She taught him counting games and rhymes which have taken the place of usual slave songs he strains to memorize. 3rd of May, the slaves are never satisfied. If they're not complaining about the cold in their quarters, it is their bed. So he always, Mr. Santos Sr. says that the slaves are always complaining. I had to raise my stick to several of them. Again, brutality. They would have been better off getting my boot up their rums instead of welts on their arms and legs. Again, brutality. 12th of May, the whole week has been taken up with the talk about the runaway. He left before dawn 3 days ago. So runaway, that history is still repeating. We could see Chapel running away. Whitechapel was interviewed on several occasions by Mr. Whitechapel. All privileges have been withdrawn from the slaves and no one is allowed out of their quarters at night. The nights are long. The slaves are miserable and many of them curse the day that runaway was born. So when someone runs away, it was misery for other people as well, other slaves as well. Mr. Whitechapel placed a notice in the Virginian, the newspaper, with a good description and a substantial reward for finding that runaway slave. I could do with that. If he comes back, he will be punished. There is a lot of this mischief about. 27th of May. So the runaway is back. Somehow they caught the runaway. The runaway is back. And he got 200 lashes. I administered half, my second the rest. And we clearly know that that is the punishment that a runaway slave gets. He had to be revived twice from a dead faint. Again, brutality. All were present and seemed suitably appalled and discouraged from imitating him. Mr. Whitechapel gave a rousing speech about leniency and loyalty. He got the slaves to promise an end to further attempts at escape. In return, he restored their privileges right away. There was a celebration well into the night. His 2 sons were present. Next one. 4th of June, that slave who was whipped caught a fever and died. Mr. Whitechapel inquired whether it was his wounds that caused his death. Mr. Santos Sr. said no. Apparently, Whitechapel lately changed from slave to physician. So now the slave Whitechapel is confirming that now that runaway was actually dead, not by fever but with the whip. So Mr. Whitechapel, and look at the way Mr. Santos Sr. talks about Whitechapel as a physician. A slave turned into a physician. July 4th, nothing much. 20th of July, Mr. Whitechapel said he has found a match for me from the plantation south of here. So now Mr. Whitechapel is forcing Santa Senior to marry. I met the toothless, palsied hag who claims she is 30 years but must be 50 to the day. Because if Santa Senior is not getting married, he clearly knew that many other people will be in trouble. 1st of August, I told my son he was big enough to learn that his mother died when he was born. So that's the point when we know that Caroline died after giving birth. And again, September 1st, Cook has given birth early to a healthy boy. So who is that boy? It is Chapel. Whitechapel was the proud father on the plantation. Whitechapel was actually the proud father on the plantation. Give me a second. So Cook has given birth to a healthy boy. Whitechapel was the proud father on the plantation. He came to see me. Whitechapel showed me the boy's swaddled-in cloth presented to him by Mr. or Mrs. Whitechapel, no doubt purchased with considerable funds held back from my pay. The child is dark, according to Whitechapel, will become as dark as the lobes of his ears indicate, which is much darker than the rest of his body. He resembles my son in all but color. So the son Santa Senior's son, Chapel, is resembling him in everything except the color. It is just the color of Chapel is black, but he resembles everything other than the color. Maybe I imagine it. As he left, I said, call the boy Whitechapel. After the man, he will know as his father. He bought my logic. His smile played up again. He is so much like us. 5th of October, Mr. Whitechapel summoned me to his house. He asked why I had not seen. So Whitechapel is inquiring about, Mr. Whitechapel is inquiring about why he is not happy in that lady. Come on, trying to highlight. Yeah, why he had not seen the woman. He went through such trouble to find me. I said I was not blessed with many of God's. I said she was not blessed with many of God's attributes. He instructed me to redouble my efforts with the woman since he could not have me on the plantation a month longer if I was not betrothed. So here, the plantation owner, Mr. Whitechapel, says that he couldn't keep Santa Senior on the plantation even a month longer if he is not betrothed, if he is not engaged. I asked him why such urgency. He replied that Whitechapel and Cook. So the reason why the emergency marriages, because Whitechapel and Cook had heard rumors from a number of slaves about the baby. So people came to realize that Cook's and Whitechapel, Cook's baby is actually Santa Senior's. So Whitechapel was distracted, Cook despondent. His view was that sooner I was married, the better for all. So that is the reason why the owner is trying to make him to marry. Sooner I marry, the better for all. Otherwise, my unmarried state would be misconstrued as dependence on the cook for further sexual favors. So keep that in mind. I'm a married man again. So finally, Mr. Santos Senior married again. Again, his forced marriage shows that he too is vulnerable to the master's order. So he had to accept the order of the. He also, even though he is a white, still he is a subordinate. So he too is actually vulnerable to the master's orders, and that he must obey certain orders of justice and punishment. And that's the reason why Mr. Whitechapel asked for the monetary fees, or like fines and everything, and now he's making him to marry again. That's all with now. My son has not taken to her. None of Caroline's clothes fit her. Thank God for small mercies. I go to bed late, and in total darkness I rise early and throw myself into my work. So that's all about Santa Senior's diary entry. So here we are getting a clear understanding about his life and his attitude towards slaves, his attitude towards women, etc. So keep all those in mind. We are seeing a very callous, emotionally hardened white slave overseer in this chapter. So keep that in mind.